A real treasure is tucked away in this garage in the Bavarian town of Tegernsee. An original Carrera RS. Thomas Müller searched long and hard to find one. He tells us that this is a 1973 Porsche Carrera RS, one of just 1,500 ever made. Porsche used the RS for motorsports and only planned to build 500. But Thomas says the car sold much better than the people in the marketing department had imagined. So in the end, they had to make 1,500. The Carrera RS is extraordinary in many respects. It was the first Porsche in the 911 series to sport the Carrera name. The RS weigh in at around 100 kilos less than the standard 911S. And it was the first Porsche fitted with a big rear spoiler. Engine performance was increased by using a sportier camshaft, modified cylinder heads and a larger 210 horsepower carburettor. The vast majority of RS buyers opted for the touring version, which featured a more comfortable interior. Thomas says the biggest difference between the RS and standard 911 from 1973 was the body. The RS was the first Porsche to feature a front spoiler made of plexiglass. And he says the car was nicknamed the Ducktail due to the look of its rear spoiler, which was designed to increase downforce and make the vehicle grip the road better.
Und dadurch bessere Straßenlage erzielen sollte.
Thomas says the car goes like the devil, but he admits that at very high speeds the front end can lift off. So drivers need quite a bit of courage to push this car to its limits.
Das Auto an seine Grenzen zu bringen.
Listening to the sound of the six-cylinder boxer engine is a treat in itself. Thomas likens the typical boxer sound to poetry. He says that after work he goes into the garage and turns on the engine, and it makes his day. Now Thomas is driving his dream car to a Porsche meet. Fellow Carrera fan Harold will be there too. But unlike Thomas, Harold doesn't own an original RS. His RS is a replica based on a 991S, but it looks very much like the real deal. Thomas says the difference between the RS and a standard 911 from the same era can be seen at the rear, mainly the rear spoiler and the rear bumper. Otherwise, he says it's very hard to tell them apart. Thomas warns that there are lots of replicas around and that buyers need to be aware of that. Harold explains how he converted a 911 into an RS. He says they optimized the performance of the basic 2.7-litre Porsche engine by increasing the cubic capacity, using a different camshaft and a flywheel from a 911 RSR, as well as making other small changes. Thomas and Harold built a slalom course on a closed-off lot to give their Porsches a real workout. Thomas says the attraction of drifting with the Carrera is that it's got a really great tail swing. The Carrera RS is now one of the most sought-after classic cars around. Originals in good condition sell for upwards of €200,000. Some in tip-top shape fetch close to €300,000. In the early 1970s, the Carrera RS was unbeatable in its class on the international racing scene. It rocketed from 0 to 100 kilometers an hour in just 5.6 seconds, a sensation at the time. It was also the first 911 to have different size front and rear tyres. Thomas says the Carrera has a fairly high performance threshold, but it's also very narrow. There's a fine line between a nice drift and spinning out. So only experienced drivers like Thomas and Harold should ever push their Porsche to the limit like this. Thomas drives his RS home along country roads. Here on dry streets, the Carrera really comes into its own. Thomas tells us that the difference between his RS and Porsche's newer models is like night and day, and that even that fails to describe it. The RS has no electronic driving aids, no electronic stability program, no ABS, no power steering. Everything is done manually, just as it was in the 1970s. He says the physical feedback is part of the driving pleasure. And that's why Thomas Müller wouldn't trade his original Carrera RS for all the money in the world.